Thanks, Greg. And as I said, it's an honour to be back in Somaliland. In this opening session, what I want to do is to sort of admire the problem a little bit, and I want to start by asking the fairly obvious question: what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? And I want to suggest that it's a problem in three interlinked parts. The first one, which I think is pretty obvious to many of us, is that outsiders to a conflict lack local knowledge, but they often have vast amounts of money, political influence, firepower, weaponry, so they tend to come in and impose unworkable solutions without serious consultation. And then they spend vast resources over time that create a corrupt elite that is dependent on those unworkable solutions that outsiders are imposing. That creates in itself a series of vested interests, both in the aid and development community, in the military industrial complex, and within the country concerned. And that leads to the outside interveners becoming committed to their solutions through a process of sunk costs. Of course, that then leads them to continuing on well past the point at which any rational observer would have concluded that efforts led by outsiders have failed. And that is in many ways the story of Afghanistan that Greg and I wrote about in the ledger. But of course, we could put up literally dozens of similar examples that illustrate the same dynamic. So we know that outside-led solutions frequently fail, and they often make things worse. Now, an important piece of context here is that the term outsider, as I'm using it here, doesn't necessarily mean foreigner, right? All foreigners are outsiders by definition, but not all outsiders are foreigners. At the village level, the district governor might be an outsider. At the district level, provincial or national officials are almost always outsiders. And of course, in many countries, urban elites, dominant ethnic groups, people from inland or coastal communities are outsiders in relation to others. So the first part of the problem is that outside-led solutions often don't work, and they often make the problem worse. The second part of the problem, though, is the flip side, which is that conversely, insiders, actual participants in a conflict, often don't have a clear idea of workable solutions either. They know their own conflict intimately well, but they don't have what you might call a large N perspective on what forms of effort typically work or typically fail. And they don't generally have a detailed understanding of any conflict other than their own. They're also emotionally committed to the conflict. As soon as somebody gets killed, the moral and emotional landscape changes, and so does the political landscape, of course, for all participants. And the violence itself becomes a key driver of the conflict. And once a conflict becomes entrenched, which happens much more quickly, days to weeks, right, than we might like to think. But once that conflict becomes entrenched, it's very hard for people to pull back. You might also find a lot of insiders who are actually conflict entrepreneurs, who are trying to continue and profit from a conflict rather than end it. So as a result of all those factors, inside-led solutions, if they're only led by insiders, often fail as well. And then the third part of the problem, which sort of underpins and exacerbates the other two, is that in a violent environment, it's simply not safe for participants in a conflict to come together and discuss their problem. Until people feel that they're safe enough to talk with each other without being killed or their community being attacked, they won't be willing to set weapons aside and engage in dialogue, and we shouldn't expect them to be. Likewise, until it's safe for outsiders to come in and take part in conflict resolution, then the outsiders have to operate with guns and dogs and armoured vehicles and drones and technicals and a whole vast array of security architecture, which makes it almost impossible to have a reasonable conversation with a member of a local community, and often makes the conflict worse in itself. So based on all of that, about a decade ago, Greg and I, through work here in the Horn of Africa, in Afghanistan, and a number of other places, evolved an approach that some people later on described as a conflict resolution triangle. It's certainly not the only approach, and it very often fails. But let me just lay it out here in this first session as a starting point for thinking about the problem set. And I think the first and essential part of this is to make a safe environment for dialogue. And there's really only three ways that this can happen, right? One, the conflict burns itself out through a process of exhaustion. Two, some actor makes a safe environment locally that enables conflict to be resolved. Or, and this is the most common, we remove key interlocutors to a third location where it's safe for them to have that discussion. And of course, we could spend an entire week just talking about that first part of the problem, but we can talk about it, I guess, in the discussion later. The second element is the role of insiders. And as Greg mentioned earlier, insiders play the critical role. They provide leadership, commitment, sustained dialogue, patience, intimate knowledge of local conditions and of what will and won't work. And they end up holding the pen, as it were, on any agreement or any proposed way forward. Outsiders need to play a supporting role, bringing that large end perspective on ways to approach specific problems, access to resources that have to be limited and very tightly focused on peace resolution, not on creating a corrupt dynamic that can sustain the conflict. And then they bring a body of expertise developed through multiple other conflict environments. And then how this works essentially is that outsiders support the insiders in developing a way forward, crafting possible solutions, and then letting the insiders tear those solutions apart and reassemble them in a way that makes sense for their unique conditions. And most importantly, any outside actor then needs to step back, let insiders take the lead, and provide just behind-the-scenes support only. And I think what I'm saying is probably echoing with people in terms of successful conflict resolution examples that we've seen. But to be clear, that approach often fails, right? All conflict resolution approaches often fail. But because this particular way of doing it is dramatically less costly, there's much less commitment of prestige, of resources, of time, of political capital. It's much more discreet, and it's easier to reset, restart, and try again when it does fail. So it's sort of a fail early, fail often, and then recover model. Again, we can talk about positive examples where this has worked. But I would just say that it isn't a log frames process, right? It's not a process of constructing an engineering solution to a conflict. It's much more of a dynamic, interrelational process, more like dating than engineering. It's dynamic, it's iterative, it's complex. There's an action learning cycle involved, and it might be interrupted or intermittent as a result of all of that. I won't steal Matt Bryden's thunder because I know he's talking about this later on, but obviously Somaliland versus Somalia is almost the perfect natural experiment to illustrate this dynamic. You know, we're ethnically identical, geographically co-located, parallel colonial histories, although with significant variation due to the difference between British and Italian colonialism, then a shared history of 30 years under post-1960 Somalia. But today we see in south-central Somalia a clear example of a failed outside-led intervention that has stumbled through multiple phases and efforts by multiple agencies, one that's still struggling, and arguably where the efforts of outsiders have often made things worse. And, you know, the birth of Al-Shabaab from the youth wing of the Union of Islamic Courts as a result of the US-encouraged Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in 2006 is probably the classic case of a problem that we are still dealing with, resulting from ill-judged but well-meaning attempts by outsiders to resolve a conflict. Conversely, as we all know, here in Somaliland, we see a series of peaceful democratic transitions of power, economic growth, post-conflict reconstruction, emergence of a functioning economy through self-generated and often self-financed efforts. But just note what I said earlier about outsiders. Outsiders have actually played a very significant role in what's happened here in Somaliland, but not necessarily the United Nations or the US or the EU or those sorts of outside institutions, but rather members of the Somaliland diaspora. People that have left the country but then come back, the sort of intellectual remittances, as we sometimes call it, of talent coming back to the country, the money that people who were living in Dubai or the Middle East were able to invest in the country, so that the inside-outside dynamic has really been a key part of success in Somaliland, even though it doesn't necessarily look like that from the outside. But very importantly, it's the centrality of local leadership that has, in my view, driven that success. So to wrap up, there's a mystery here, right? Or a form of magic or alchemy that is opaque or hard to understand for most of the participants, I suspect. But for sure, local leaders being in charge, not flooding the environment with lots of foreign resources, ownership of the process by local players, as Greg said, but then access to outside expertise through diaspora members or sympathetic friends have all played a key role. But I guess precisely how it happened, very few people know, even those people that were part of the process. So I guess the short answer to the question that we posed in the title for this session about, is it inside out or outside in? The answer to that question seems to be both, right? It's both of those things, but we're dealing with a very complex three-part problem set that needs enormous amounts of sensitivity and, frankly, luck in order to succeed. So with that as a set of framing comments, Greg, I might hand back to you